Romans 3:21 through 26. I'm reading from the New King James, so we'll hear that first. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of one who has faith in Jesus. And like I said, when I read that, immediately a red flag jumped up at me. Anybody catch what that one is? And I'll even give you the hint. The same word gets used back to back in one sentence and is either repeating itself or is messed up royal. Happens early on. Okay, the word is faith and belief, because those are the same word. If you look at verse 22, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Faith in Jesus Christ, believe. Faith in Jesus Christ and faith. All who believe in Jesus Christ and believe. That doesn't make sense. Because if you believe in Jesus Christ and you believe, why did it get said that way? Go ahead with the Authorized Translation on that.
Starting at verse 21.
Yes, just read 21 and 22 for now.
But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference.
By the faith of Jesus Christ, not in. Because if it's believe and believe, why did it get said that way? But what is our faith based upon? God and the faith of Jesus that was the reason he went to Calvary. He acted in faith, and because of his action, we can believe. This isn't a double, in a sense, a double weakness kind of statement. This is establishing the power upon which we have our belief. The Authorized King James translated it correctly. However, to soften it up for every other denomination that came after that, instead of it being about the faithfulness of Jesus, it knocks it down. Because we're going to see at the end of this what we're called to have. So, hitting real quick again, the way it gets translated in most modern translations, but now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God. So, okay, what's being witnessed to? The righteousness of God. What is being witnessed to? God's righteousness. By what? The faith, Authorized Version, of Jesus Christ. What witnesses to the righteousness of God? Jesus' own obedience to the will of the Father. We know the truth of that statement. But to water it down, it becomes faith in Jesus And then the second bad translation in this passage, verse 26. To demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of one who has faith in Jesus. In, exact same word that we saw up top. Except, what was the change up top? It was from in to of. And guess what? The literal translation of verse 26 is the same thing. Of. What are we called to have? The faith of Jesus. Why? Because we are called to act in the same way, in the accordance of the will of the Father. There is a huge, mile-wide difference between having faith in Jesus, because we can all say that Jesus is the answer, and acting with the faith of Jesus, meaning we are called to act in accordance with God's will the same way Jesus was. That is a brutal, powerful statement. It's not the wishy-washy that we get in the modern translations. And I think everybody can understand it's a lot easier to take it the way it's written in the modern translations. All you got to do is have faith in Jesus. Even the authors at the time of King James understood how the Church of England operated then. Who were the people in the Church of England back then that were supposed to be acting Christ-like? The clergy. They were the ones that were expected to be the official religious people, the official people following God all the way. And then you have the laity, who can't necessarily follow as committedly as the clergy, because the clergy are paid to be good and everybody else has to work to pay them to be good. And we understand when we say it that way, this is crazy talk. But how did King James have the Bible translated? To back up the Church of England. The cool thing was, they showed the problem in how they translated it. They translated it right the first time, and to please King James, they translated it wrong the second time. However, to make everybody happy today, we do a double wrong translation. It's when you remember faith and belief are the exact same word, that every time you read a passage like verse 22, you go, wait a second, why in the world did he say the same thing twice? Faith in Jesus and believing in Jesus. Faith and faith, or belief and belief. Why did he repeat himself? He didn't. And in the authorized King James, the possessive of got translated correctly. Having the faith of Jesus. It was his faith that caused him to be obedient unto death, giving witness to the righteousness of God. And that makes sense to all of us. And we don't have a problem with that. So that people wouldn't have problem with the practice of the Church of England and now today. So people don't have to feel guilty about practicing churchianity. The same abuse of the language got perpetuated into 26. So we don't have to feel guilty when we are not acting with the faith of Christ. This is why I said, I want to say it was almost a month ago on a Wednesday night, We need to be careful because at times mistranslation is intentional. It's done to perpetuate current practices in different denominations. This is one that when you remember in fact is, I'll tell you right now, 80% of the time I will call foul on translation is when you have a faith belief situation like we have in verse 22. That I'll read a passage and it's like, wait a second, you're repeating yourself if you put the word faith in both spots or put the word belief in both spots. Why is it that you're repeating it? You go back to the original language, or back in most cases to the original King James. And in the original King James, they were trying to do an almost word for word kind of translation. So 22 gets translated right. And in a lot of the modern translations, what you'll see is the authorized King James translation on the side. The main text will say it like it does in the New King James, having faith in Jesus Christ. But how does our faith in Jesus show the righteousness of God compared to the faith of Jesus demonstrating the righteousness of God? Everybody here agree that Jesus dying on the cross showed God's righteousness and intention? I'd have to say, yeah, we all believe that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. That's the key that shows us down in 26, that same two-letter word in, dealing with faith, purposely gets mistranslated so that everybody can feel comfy just coming and sitting in a pew. And as long as I'm a nice person, I'm pretty okay and saved. Whereas what it really says, the justifier of one who has the faith of Jesus, meaning is willing to act in the will of God. Not just the polite, yes, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. Well, that's a good start, but that's not what it's asking for and demanding. And here's the other kick. What have we just read in the first two chapters, or second half of the first one, all of chapter 2 and the first part of 3? You can't claim circumcision as your justification before God if it's not a circumcision of the heart. You can't claim baptism as your justification if it hasn't transformed your entire life. So the end of this passage here in verse 26 is a reiteration of that point. What's the faith that acknowledges the righteousness of God? One that acts. Who acted the most? Jesus. He gave witness by his faith in following God's will. And at the end, just like we talked about throughout all of chapter 2, what do we have to have? We have to have a faith like Christ that is going to act on the conviction of the rightness and the righteousness of the will of God. Or we have the modern translation and what was being condemned in chapter 2. Does that make sense? I know this was sort of brutal because, like I said, I was talking to Vicki about this last night. Oh boy, we're going to hit 2 points of bad translation. It is provable from the text itself that it's bad translation. And, okay, this was a point I was hammering on about a month and a half ago, that the faith of God that we are called to have is a faith that acts on godly righteousness. Paul, when he is swinging the hammer against racism on both sides, whether that be the Jew or the Gentile. It's telling them, whoa, wake up. Your artificial lines are trash. The only thing that counts, and first he's hammering on the Jew, is a life that reflects the completeness of change that baptism is supposed to bring about. Your Jewishness gets you nothing, especially if all that your Jewishness was the physical act of circumcision. If it wasn't a circumcision of the heart, it was worthless. Your Christianity, if all it's based on is your baptism and you're claiming the name, it is a waste and is useless because it is not followed through by action. It is ridiculed by the nations when all it is I name it and claim it. I'm a Christian. Boom, that makes me one. No, not by what chapter 2 said, and by a better translation of chapter 3. No way, Jose, does it count unless it's committed and convicted like Christ. Because what are we believing in? In the first part, verse 21 and 22, we're supposed to be believing in the righteousness of God. And everything else is supposed to be backing the righteousness of God. That's why it's not believe. It's believe, and who else points to it? The law, the prophets, and Jesus' own faith all the way to death at Calvary's cross. That's the first part. And then the last part is hammering down the exact same point again. And this is why we're called to study, to pay attention. Because I didn't have the Greek in front of me when I was reading it. And truth is, I have only gotten through Greek 1, and I hate it. It is such a struggle. But knowing that the word faith and belief is the same word is enough to throw up the most important red flags you'll encounter when reading scripture in the New Testament for when error is being injected by the translation. And almost every time the error that is being injected is the weaker concept of faith. Everybody follow what we've been through here now? Because I know it's pushing it a bit, but you already had it you heard what the authorized said on the first one. And like I said, in your commentary stuff, you will often find now the literal translation. It will say for verse 26 is the one who has the faith of Jesus. Does anybody have that actually in theirs? Because I had it in mine, but then again, I'm working with Jakarta, so that's covering a bit more with the different translations.
It had it on 22, but didn't have it on 26.
Okay, yours had the 22 one? Okay. 22 is the one you'll tend to find consistently. 26, because it's a literal translation, tends to get left off. I found it with mine, but that's with my Bible. So, and now think about that. 26, what it said was literal translation. When they make translations of texts, they do not always go with the literal. Because rule number 1 is, does it agree with past translations? I'm like, you understand that if there's an error with past translations, you're just repeating the same error. And in the case of King James, we know why he would want that in there. Because he wanted that differentiation between clergy and laity. He wanted the power control, because who's the head of the King of England? I mean, oh, that was good, Rich. Who's the head of the King of England? Who's the head of the Church of England? The King. He wants the people under the authority of the King. This one says you are fully under the authority of God, acting as Jesus did in faith, but acting. no sheeple that are ignorant, and clergy that are knowledgeable. All bear a similar responsibility to strive to act. Because like, okay, what am I? I'm Mr. IT. For 30 years plus, I've got the pins, I've got the watch. I might not have the watch, I might have given that away because I didn't care about it being a Gator watch, but I think somebody else in my family might have, so I gave it to him. But yeah, I put in the time as IT. That doesn't clear me of my responsibility to study and apply. We're called to make a Christ-like effort because it is his faith we're supposed to be mirroring. Now, let's take that one on another level. How are we to communicate to others the best way possible about what kind of faith they're supposed to have? Who gets written about in 4 different books the same way? Jesus. Whose faith are we witness to from 4 different perspectives? And yet his faith shows consistently. And the answer is again, Jesus. So if we're going to go to the Bible and find a consistent example of what it means to have faith in the righteousness of God, who's our best example? Jesus. So when we take the time to back away from it, far enough to look back to what chapter 2 has said, far enough to think about what we are called to be Christ-like, it's not just in actions, it's an intention of the heart, it's in faith of God the Father. Because who raises Jesus from the dead? It's not Jesus. It is the Father that directs the Spirit, and it's by that power that he is raised. Jesus trusted the Father all the way when he goes to Calvary. That it's not even Jesus who resurrects himself. It's not by his power. It's by the same power that he walked on the water, by the same power that he fed thousands, by the same power that he would raise others from the dead, by the same power that each of the apostles was able to perform signs and wonders. They didn't do it any differently than he did. This part of chapter 3 is letting them know, hey, how serious do we need to be in our faith compared to the mockery the world has seen this far? And he lets them know, hammer blow, as serious as the spikes going through your hands and your feet for the sake of the righteousness of God. Ready to move forward a little bit? Okay. Verse 27. Where is boasting then is excluded? By what law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. Which faith are we talking about? Faith of Jesus. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith. Which kind of faith? Of Jesus. What kind of faith is it? It's an active faith. Apart from the deeds of the law. Now here's that flip. Because what did the Jews up until Calvary think was what made them right? Following the law. I'm a better person because the law says I've got to give 10%. I gave 10%. Therefore, I am good. Can you follow the law and be a miserable, nasty piece of trash? Oh, yeah. Just because I obey the speed limit doesn't make me a nice person. Just because I haven't shot anybody doesn't make me a compassionate, considering person. Following the law got them nothing if it wasn't in here as well. Go ahead.
They didn't follow the law to begin with, so it's like there was no way. I mean, each sacrifice wasn't. I mean, look at Cain. I mean,
Yes. Well, and okay, look at Cain. He followed the law insofar as he offered a sacrifice,
right.
but he didn't do what he knew to do relative to what God desired. I'm the one giving you the bounty.
Yeah, his heart wasn't in it.
Right.
And that shows right there at the start. His heart wasn't in it. So, I mean,
And you already put out the other part of it too. None of them were successfully keeping the entirety of the law. And if you can't keep the entirety of the law, trying to brag about the keeping of the law is hyper-hypocritical. There we go. Got the P in the right place. So, yeah, for the Jew, this is a bit of a wake-up. One, you weren't getting it right anyway because it was the wrong kind of response. But two, you weren't getting it right anyways because you weren't following it in its entirety. So holding that up as your boasting point doesn't cut it. And oh, by the way, you Gentiles, or Greeks, guess what's coming for you next? Continuing with that, or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also, since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Okay, number one, what kind of faith? An active faith acting in the righteousness of God. What was the law's purpose? To show right and wrong. If we are acting in faith to show God's righteousness, what are we showing about the law? The rightness of it. Thou shalt not commit adultery. We don't just not commit adultery. As Christians, we are called to show love in the case of a husband. As Christ loved the church, so should a husband show love to their wife. How different is that than thou shalt not commit adultery? Thou shalt not commit adultery is itty bitty. Love your wife as Christ loved the church is huge. Does it invalidate thou shalt not commit adultery, or does it prove it? Proves it. It shows the law was right. Remembering the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That was a specific law that they had, but what was the principle? Show reverence and respect for God and all that he has done. What should our lives reflect? Showing reverence and respect for all that God has done. That principle didn't disappear when the letter of the law ended. That same principle that they should, because you could have obeyed, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I'm not going to work on the Sabbath. I'm still going to bless out my wife because she didn't make the pancakes right yesterday at a meeting this morning, and she didn't put in enough salt, or she put in too much salt, and I'm going to let her know what I think about that. That's not showing honor and respect, because what am I supposed to be doing as far as the cooking and stuff goes? Backing off on it. This isn't the day to work, and I shouldn't be judging somebody else for the work that they did the day before, because I didn't have to work to make it myself. If we honor the principles, they're still there. They're still just as right. And the fact that we as Christians should be showing that full spectrum as opposed to letter of the law obedience only. Like it says here, we establish the law. We establish the principles upon which the law was founded. We also establish the righteousness of God, which is what we started off with back in verses 21 and 22. What is this about? Establishing the righteousness of God. How do we show the world the righteousness of God? Living it. And when we live it fully, as opposed to letter of the law style, then the rest of the world goes, yeah, that's the relationship I want to have with my spouse, because that is sweet. That's the kind of relationship I want to have parent to child, because that's awesome. Excuse me. Every time I get the chance, I let dads, because it's the only ones I've seen, oh boy. Actually, no, there's one mom. But for the most part, it's been dads. I let every dad know that I see in archery that I'm proud to know them. Because they're there with their kid. They are doing archery so they have that commonality to be able to continue talking with their child. And last night it was Rich Mathis. Not last night, Friday night. Friday night, Rich Mathis. Rich Mathis is the cool old man you want to have as a grandfather, and he's there with his grandson. Rich Mathis has bows that are more expensive than mine, but to be with his grandson the same way his grandson was there, he gets an itty bitty cheaper Genesis bow. Genesis bows cost $200. His personal bow cost $2,000. To be with his grandson, he shoots this $200 bow that the string is a little too wobbly, the whole frame is too wobbly, he's struggling to get a good score, which means I had my good bow. I beat him, yes! But he's there for his grandson. He's showing his grandson love. He's showing his grandson respect, because I'm doing the same activity. I'm coming along and working with you. When I'm training you on this, I'm doing the same thing I'm teaching you. Sounds like, I think, 1 Peter, where it says, you that are young, learn it. You that are older than the young, apply it. You that are older, teach it, remembering you were once one that learned. Remembering you are one who has done and knows the value of it. So that when they finally get to your stage, they're ready to repeat that cycle. Every time I see that cycle in action, I let the person know I appreciate that you're doing that. Do I need to quote Bible to show a right vision for what it means to be a parent? Or can I say that good is good and I'm glad to see it? Which is going to have the bigger impact? Reading 1 Peter to them, or shaking their hand and saying, I am happy and proud to know you as a fellow archer and as a fellow parent or grandparent. You've made my day. What's now going forward? A love that when the opportunity presents and they ask a question, are they going to listen to me when I start talking about my reason for believing what I believe? Oh yeah, why? Because they know it's not lip service. It's coming from in here. Romans chapter 2. It's got to come from in here. Romans chapter 3. What did Jesus do? All the way to the cross. What was in here? His faith in the righteousness of the Father. And my phone is going off and letting me know that even though I'm not tucking it in my pocket, we're up against the time. Thank you very much. We'll be picking up with chapter 4 next week. Boom, pencil. Something to write on. I don't have my glasses, so